My name is Alana Mitchell, and at 24, I never thought I'd be testifying against my own stepbrother in court. That night changed everything, waking up to a searing pain in my shoulder, seeing Brandon standing over me with a kitchen knife, blood dripping onto my sheets. The worst part wasn't the stabbing. It was hearing my parents laughing it off the next morning, calling me dramatic and attention-seeking. 2 years later, as the judge delivered his verdict, the courtroom fell silent. My parents weren't laughing anymore. Sometimes justice comes from the most unexpected places. Before I dive into the nightmare that became my life, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. This family revenge story took me to the darkest places I've ever been, but also showed me strength I never knew I had. If you've ever felt betrayed by those who should have protected you, hit that like button and subscribe to show support for survivors everywhere. Now, let me take you back to where it all began. Until I was 16, life was pretty normal. My mom Kimberly and I had a good relationship after she divorced my dad when I was 9. She worked hard as a real estate agent to give us a comfortable life in our modest 3-bedroom house. We had movie nights, baked cookies on weekends, and she always made time to help with my homework. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours. Everything changed when Mom met Richard Wilson at a charity gala she was working. He was a wealthy widower who owned several car dealerships across the state. She came home that night practically floating, talking about this charming man who'd asked for her number. "He's different, Alana," she insisted when I made a face. "Not like the others." Within weeks, Richard was a constant presence in our lives. He brought expensive gifts, took us to fancy restaurants, and always had this way of making Mom giggle like a teenager. At first, I was happy for her. She deserved someone who made her smile. Then I met Brandon, Richard's 17-year-old son. Our first meeting was at an upscale steakhouse. He seemed nice enough, if a bit quiet. He shook my hand firmly and made polite conversation about school and music. But something in his eyes made me uneasy. A calculating look that disappeared so quickly I thought I'd imagined it. Brandon still processing his mother's death. Richard explained when I mentioned Brandon seemed a bit off. It's been 3 years. But these things take time. As Mom and Richard's relationship intensified, we spent more time at their mansion. It was legitimately a mansion, with 6 bedrooms, a pool, and grounds that required a full-time gardener. Richard insisted we move in after only 6 months of dating. "It makes more sense," he argued. "Why pay rent when there's plenty of room here?" That's when the red flags started appearing. Brandon would suddenly be standing in doorways watching me, claiming he just happened to be passing by. I'd find my things slightly moved or rearranged. Once, I came back from the bathroom to find him scrolling through my phone. "Just seeing what games you have," he said with a shrug, tossing it back onto the couch. When I told Mom about these incidents, she dismissed my concerns. "He's just adjusting, honey. It's hard bringing 2 families together. Give him time." Richard proposed to Mom over Christmas with a diamond ring that probably cost more than our old house. The wedding was planned for June, a lavish affair with over 300 guests, most of whom were Richard's business associates and friends. I barely recognized my own mother in her designer gown, hair and makeup professionally done, laughing with people she'd never mentioned before. During the reception, Brandon gave a toast that made my skin crawl. "To my new mother and sister," he said, pausing uncomfortably long before the word sister. "Dad always said family comes first. I believe in keeping the family line pure and strong." People chuckled awkwardly, but Richard beamed with pride. Moving day was tense. Brandon accidentally knocked over a box containing my grandmother's antique jewelry box, shattering the hand-painted lid. "Oops," he said flatly. "Guess some things aren't meant to make the transition." I fought back tears as I gathered the pieces. That box was the last gift my grandmother had given me before she died. Richard, seeing my distress, immediately offered a solution. "I'll buy you a new one, Alana. A better one. Something from Tiffany, perhaps?" He didn't understand that the value wasn't in the price tag, but in the memories it held. As I started my freshman year of college, I chose to live at home to save money. Despite Richard's offer to pay for a dorm, something told me I needed to keep an eye on my mother, who was changing in subtle ways. She drank more, dressed differently, and seemed constantly anxious about pleasing Richard. My concerns about Brandon escalated. Small things in my room would go missing: a hairbrush, a textbook, even underwear from my laundry basket. I installed a small security camera in my bedroom, but within 2 days, it mysteriously stopped working. The memory card was missing. Brandon's friends started coming over regularly, making themselves at home in our shared spaces. One of them, Tyler, cornered me in the kitchen late one night. "Brandon says you're not a real sister," he slurred, alcohol on his breath. "Says there's no blood between you, so it doesn't count." I pushed past him and locked myself in my room, shaking. The first major confrontation happened at a family dinner when Richard's parents were visiting. Brandon made a joke about me being a heavy sleeper. "Nothing wakes her up," he said casually. "I've proven it multiple times." "What does that mean?" I demanded, knuckles white around my forehead. Nothing, Richard interjected quickly. "Brandon, mind your manners." But the damage was done. I saw the knowing look between father and son. I installed a deadbolt on my bedroom door the next day. 2 years into our new family dynamic, tensions were constantly high. Brandon acted as if he owned the house and everyone in it. He would enter rooms without knocking, use my things without asking, and make comments about my appearance that made my skin crawl. "That shirt looks good on you, sis. Really shows off your assets." Or, "You should wear your hair down more. I like it better that way." Richard enabled these behaviors, dismissing my complaints as overreactions. "Boys will be boys, Alana. He's just trying to bond with you in his way. You're too sensitive." My mother had changed dramatically. She was drinking almost daily now, starting with mimosas at breakfast and ending with wine or vodka tonics at night. When I tried to talk to her about Brandon, she would wave her hand dismissively. "Richard says you're imagining things. Maybe you should see someone about your anxiety." The locks I installed on my door kept mysteriously getting fixed. Richard claimed it was a fire hazard. I would come home to find my door unlocked, despite definitely locking it before leaving. One day, I was borrowing Mom's hairspray and found my own hairbrush in Brandon's bathroom drawer. When I confronted him, he claimed I must have left it there. I knew I hadn't been in his bathroom since we moved in. Things escalated when I was using Brandon's laptop to print a paper. Our printer was connected to his computer. A notification popped up from his photo storage. The thumbnail showed what looked like my room. I clicked it before I could think better of it. There were dozens of photos of me sleeping, me studying at my desk, me getting dressed with my back to the door, all taken through my bedroom doorway or window, hands shaking. I copied the photos to a USB drive and took it straight to Richard and my mother. I expected shock, anger on my behalf, something. Instead, Richard calmly took the drive, examined a few photos, and sighed. "Alana, planting evidence isn't going to make us take your claims more seriously. This is getting out of hand." "Planting? I found these on his computer." I was nearly screaming. "Brandon already told us you've been threatening to prove he's some kind of stalker," my mother said, not meeting my eyes. "He warned us you might do something like this." I felt like I was losing my mind. Somehow, Brandon had anticipated my discovery and preemptively discredited me. That night, I heard Richard and Brandon arguing in Richard's study. "You need to be more careful," Richard hissed. "Handle the situation better." "I am handling it," Brandon replied. "She'll be gone soon enough." I started working part-time at a campus coffee shop, saving every penny in a secret account Richard didn't know about. I needed an escape plan. During my sophomore year, I met Rachel in my psychology class. She was kind, funny, and immediately picked up on something being wrong when she came over to study. "Your stepbrother gives me major creeper vibes," she whispered after Brandon had spent an hour coincidentally walking through the living room where we were working. "The way he looks at you isn't brotherly at all." It was the first time someone else had validated my concerns. I broke down and told her everything. Rachel listened without judgment and then made an offer that brought me to tears. "My parents have a guest room. You could stay with us until you figure things out." I started making plans to move out, carefully and quietly. Brandon must have sensed something was changing because he suddenly became enraged when he found a brochure for campus housing in my backpack. "You're not going anywhere," he said, tearing it to pieces. "This is your home now, with us." When I told Richard and Mom I was considering moving to campus, they presented a united front. "If you move out against our wishes, we'll cut you off completely," Richard stated flatly. "No tuition, no car, no phone, Nothing. Please, Alana, Mom pleaded, fear in her eyes. Just try harder to get along. For me, with only 6 months left until I finished my associate's degree, I decided to stick it out. Once I had that diploma, I could transfer to a school further away. Brandon's behavior shifted unexpectedly. He became almost brotherly, offering to help with assignments, bringing me coffee when he made some, respecting my space. It was jarring and more unsettling than the overt creepiness. Richard was thrilled. See? I told you he just needed time. The family is finally coming together, but I stayed vigilant. The sudden change felt calculated, like he was trying to lull me into a false sense of security. I doubled down on my escape plan, applying to universities in different states and securing recommendations from professors. Just 6 more months, I told myself. I could handle anything for 6 more months. The day before everything changed seemed deceptively normal. It was a Tuesday in April, with final exams just 2 weeks away. We had a family dinner where Richard announced a summer vacation to the Bahamas to celebrate Alana finishing her associate's degree, he said, raising a glass. Brandon smiled at me across the table, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. After dinner, I overheard Richard and Brandon arguing in the study again. I paused in the hallway, holding my breath to listen. "This isn't what we discussed," Richard hissed. "You're supposed to be handling the situation, not making it worse." "I am handling it," Brandon replied coldly. "My way." "If this blows back on us," Richard warned, "it won't. Trust me." I hurried to my room, locking the door behind me. Whatever they were planning, I wanted no part of it. I spent the evening studying for my American literature final, finally crawling into bed around midnight, exhausted. The next thing I remember was pain. Sharp, searing pain in my left shoulder that jolted me from deep sleep. My eyes flew open to see Brandon standing over me, his face eerily illuminated by my bedside lamp. He was holding a kitchen knife, the blade already dark with my blood. "You don't belong in this family," he whispered, his voice calm, almost gentle. "You never did." I screamed, a raw, primal sound that tore from my throat. Brandon tried to cover my mouth with his free hand, but I bit down hard. He reeled back, cursing, as I scrambled to get away, my shoulder burning with each movement. My bedroom door burst open. Richard and my mother stood there in their nightclothes, taking in the scene, me pressed against the headboard, blood soaking my pajama top and sheets, Brandon standing with the knife still in his hand. For one brief, hopeful moment, I thought they would help me, that the sight of their son attacking their daughter would finally break through their delusion. Instead, Brandon immediately shifted his expression to one of fear and confusion. "She attacked me in my sleep," he cried, dropping the knife as if it burned him. "I came in to borrow her phone charger and she went crazy. I grabbed the knife to defend myself." The knife was clearly from our kitchen. It had Brandon's fingerprints all over the handle. The angle of my wound made it physically impossible to be self-inflicted. I was asleep, for God's sake. The evidence was irrefutable. But Richard chose not to see it. "What did you do?" he asked me, his voice low and dangerous. "What did I do? I was sleeping. He stabbed me." I pressed my hand to my shoulder, blood seeping between my fingers. "You've been looking for ways to discredit Brandon for years," Richard said coldly. "This is a new low, even for you." My mother stood frozen, her eyes darting between us all, before finally landing on Brandon. "Are you okay, sweetie?" she asked him, completely ignoring my bleeding wound. I couldn't believe what was happening. Richard pulled out his phone, but instead of calling 911, he called his private physician, Dr. Geller. "We have a situation," he said cryptically. "Yes, at the house. Discreet, as always." While we waited, my mother helped Brandon clean blood off his hands and face, murmuring comforting words to him. Richard stood guard at my door, preventing me from leaving. I sat on my bed, pressing a towel to my wound, in a state of shock. Dr. Geller arrived 30 minutes later, a thin man with nervous eyes who had treated the family for years. He examined my shoulder with clinical detachment. "This needs stitches," he said, "and properly cleaned at a hospital. There could be nerve damage." "Just fix it here," Richard ordered. "This is a family matter." Dr. Geller looked uncomfortable but complied, cleaning and stitching my wound in my bathroom while Richard watched. He gave me antibiotics and painkillers from his bag. You should really go to a hospital, he whispered while Richard stepped out to take a call. This isn't right, but I knew no one would help me here. The doctor left, and I spent the rest of the night locked in my room, too afraid to sleep. The next morning, I dragged myself to the kitchen, my arm in a makeshift sling made from a scarf. Richard and my mother were having coffee like nothing had happened. Brandon was eating cereal, scrolling through his phone. About last night, Richard began setting down his mug. I think we all know things got out of hand. He stabbed me, I stated flatly. My mother sighed. Honey, were you sleepwalking again? Dr. Geller mentioned your medication might cause that as a side effect. I wasn't on any medication that caused sleepwalking. I wasn't on any medication at all. Brandon says you came at him with the knife, Richard continued. Given your history of emotional instability, it seems plausible you might have hurt yourself in the confrontation. Emotional instability. What are you talking about? I've never been unstable. Richard laughed, actually laughed, and shared a look with my mother. Always the drama with this one. Teenage girls, right? I was 20, not a teenager, and I had been stabbed by his son. But in that moment, seeing Brandon's smug expression and my parents' dismissal, I realized a horrible truth. I was completely unsafe in my own home, and no one was going to help me. As soon as my parents left the kitchen, I locked myself in the bathroom and texted Rachel with shaking hands. 911. Brandon stabbed me last night. Parents covering it up. Need help getting out now. Rachel's response was immediate. Oh my God, stay put, Dad and I coming. 20 minutes. I gathered my essential documents, birth certificate, social security card, ID, and passport, which I'd hidden in a hollowed-out textbook after things first got weird with Brandon. I shoved them into my backpack along with some clothes, my laptop, and the few pieces of jewelry that had real value. When Rachel's car pulled into the driveway, Richard intercepted them at the door. Alana isn't feeling well today, he said smoothly. Perhaps you can visit another time. Rachel's father, Mr. Curtis, a retired police officer, stood his ground. Alana asked us to pick her up. We're not leaving without her. She's a member of this household, and she's staying here. Richard's voice hardened. Unless you want me to call my lawyer about a kidnapping attempt. It's not kidnapping when an adult asks for help, Mr. Curtis replied calmly. And I'm curious why you're so determined to keep her here against her will. I appeared behind Richard, backpack over my uninjured shoulder. I'm leaving, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. My mother rushed to the door, eyes red-rimmed and pleading. Alana, please, we can work this out as a family. Family business stays private. Family? I laughed bitterly. Family doesn't stab each other in the middle of the night. I pulled down the collar of my shirt to show the bandaged wound. Mr. Curtis took photos with his phone while Richard sputtered threats about privacy and defamation. That's enough, Mr. Curtis said. Alana, let's go. As I walked out the door, Brandon appeared at the top of the stairs, watching with cold eyes. This isn't over, he called after me. He was right about that, but not in the way he thought. Mr. Curtis drove straight to the hospital, where doctors properly cleaned and restitched my wound. They documented everything, taking photos and detailed notes. The ER doctor, Dr. Patel, was furious about the home stitching job. This could have become seriously infected, she said, examining Dr. Geller's handiwork. And there is minor nerve damage. Did you report this assault? I shook my head, and she called the police herself. The officers who came to take my statement seemed skeptical at first. One of them knew Richard socially and kept emphasizing what a stand-up guy he was. But Detective Karen Winters was different. She listened intently, taking detailed notes and asking thoughtful questions. Rich families think different rules apply to them, she said after the other officers left. But assault is assault, no matter who your stepfather is. Within days, Richard was using his connections to try to bury my police report. The district attorney's office received calls from a state senator who golfed with Richard. The police chief suddenly had questions about allocation of resources to family disputes. But Detective Winters was like a dog with a bone. She dug into Brandon's background and discovered he had a sealed juvenile record. When she finally got access to it through a judge's order, we learned Brandon had been involved in a violent incident with a female classmate at his previous school. The girl's family had been paid off, and Brandon had been quietly transferred to a new private school. Richard's threats escalated. He sent me a formal letter threatening to sue me for defamation, to have me expelled from college for unstable behavior, and to freeze all my financial accounts. He claimed he would make sure no university in the state would accept my transfer applications. What he didn't know was that I had already been accepted to a university in another state, with a scholarship that his influence couldn't touch. More disturbing were the anonymous messages that started arriving on my new phone number that supposedly only Rachel and her parents had. Drop the charges or things will get worse for you. No one will believe you anyway. Accidents happen all the time. Detective Winters brought in a digital forensics expert who discovered spyware on my old laptop and phone. Brandon had been monitoring my communications for months, maybe years. They recovered disturbing search history from Brandon's devices, ways to make a stabbing look like self-defense, how to discredit someone, and most chillingly, how to get rid of a stepsister. There were also hundreds of photos of me, many taken while I was sleeping or changing clothes. The level of violation was staggering. As the case built, I found unexpected support. Rachel's family took me in without hesitation. A victims advocacy group connected me with a pro bono lawyer who specialized in domestic violence cases. My professors gave me extensions on finals, and one even helped connect me with housing at my new university. The hardest part was my mother's complete emotional abandonment. She left tearful voicemails begging me to come home and work things out, but never once acknowledged what Brandon had done. She chose Richard and Brandon over me, every time. I suffered from PTSD and nightmares. I would wake up feeling the knife plunging into my shoulder again, Brandon's face hovering over me. But each day I grew stronger, more determined to see this through. I wouldn't let them silence me or scare me into dropping charges. I know many of you have experienced family betrayal, and right now, it might feel like you'll never make it through. But I found strength I never knew I had during this darkest time. If you're in the middle of your own family nightmare, please keep watching. The road to justice isn't easy, but I'm living proof that it's possible, even against powerful people who think they're above the law. Richard hired Elliot Stratton, the most expensive criminal defense attorney in the state. Stratton had a reputation for getting wealthy clients off with minimal consequences, no matter the evidence against them. His retainer alone was rumored to be in the six figures. The initial hearing was surreal. Brandon played his role perfectly, the confused, innocent brother who had been attacked by his mentally unstable stepsister. He wore a blue button-down shirt that made him look younger than his 19 years. His expression appropriately solemn, but bewildered. "Your Honor, my client is the true victim here," Stratton argued smoothly. "Miss Mitchell has a documented history of animosity toward her new family and has made numerous false accusations against my client in the past." No such documentation existed, but Richard had been laying groundwork for years, telling family, friends, and associates about his troubled stepdaughter who couldn't adjust to the new family dynamic. Character witnesses lined up to testify about Brandon's exemplary character. His high school principal, his tennis coach, family, friends who had known him for years, all manipulated by Richard's influence and money. They painted a picture of Brandon as a grieving son who had welcomed his new stepsister with open arms, only to be met with hostility and false accusations. Local media picked up the story, framing it as a case of a jealous stepsister trying to ruin her privileged stepbrother's life. Richard's PR team worked overtime, feeding journalists information that painted me as unstable, ungrateful, and attention-seeking. Troubled stepdaughter accuses model son read one particularly painful headline. Public opinion initially swayed against me. I received hateful messages on social media from strangers who knew nothing about what had really happened. People I thought were friends from high school and college stopped returning my calls, unwilling to stand against the Wilson family's influence. But the prosecutor assigned to my case, Sarah Jensen, was a revelation. A petite woman in her 40s with a razor-sharp mind and a backbone of steel, she refused to be intimidated by Stratton's reputation or Richard's connections. "The evidence speaks for itself," she told me during one of our preparation meetings, "and I don't care how many senators he golfs with." The discovery phase revealed holes in Brandon's carefully constructed alibi. He claimed he'd been in his room all night until he heard a noise from my room and came to check on me, only to be attacked. But his phone's location data showed he'd been moving around the house well before the attack. More damning was security footage from a neighbor's camera that captured Brandon slipping out to the garden shed at 1:30 a.m. and returning with something in his hand, likely the knife, which was stored with gardening tools. As the evidence mounted, Richard tried to make it all go away. First, he offered a settlement, $50,000 if I dropped the charges and signed an NDA. When I refused, the offer increased to $100,000, then $200,000. My mother called me, sobbing. "Please, Alana," she begged, "take the money. We can put this all behind us. $200,000 is life-changing money." "So, is being stabbed by someone who is supposed to be family?" I replied. "This isn't about money." As the pre-trial hearings continued, Richard's company started feeling the pressure. Stocks fell as news of the case spread. Business partners became hesitant to be associated with the scandal. Richard's carefully constructed image as a family man and community leader was crumbling. Stratton filed motion after motion to exclude evidence of Brandon's past behavior, arguing it wasn't relevant to the current case. Judge Michael Connolly, a stern man in his 60s with a reputation for fairness, despite his political connections, denied most of these motions. "The pattern of behavior is relevant to establishing intent," he ruled, much to Stratton's visible frustration. Then came a breakthrough we hadn't expected. Maria Gonzalez, the family's former housekeeper, who had been fired 6 months before the stabbing, came forward after seeing the case on the news. "I saw things in that house," she told Detective Winters. "The way he watched her, followed her. Mr. Wilson knew. He always knew." Maria had been fired after mentioning to my mother that she'd seen Brandon coming out of my room when I wasn't home. Richard had personally escorted her off the property that same day, threatening to have her deported if she spread lies about his son. She had been too afraid to come forward until now. On the heels of Maria's statement came another unexpected ally, Brandon's ex-girlfriend, Sophia Reed. Despite signing an NDA after their breakup, she broke her silence, risking legal consequences, to testify about Brandon's controlling and sometimes violent behavior toward her. "He would get so angry if I spoke to other guys," she told Prosecutor Jensen. "He once threatened to hurt himself if I broke up with him, but then said he'd hurt me instead because it would be more effective." Richard's desperation grew as his attempts to control the narrative failed. In a move that would ultimately be his undoing, he tried to bribe a potential juror, approaching them in a parking garage with an offer of $50,000 for a not guilty verdict. The juror immediately reported it to the court. Judge Connolly was livid, but kept the attempted bribery quiet while an investigation proceeded, not wanting to taint the upcoming trial. The case became a lightning rod for discussions about family violence, privilege, and justice. Survivor advocacy groups held rallies outside the courthouse. Op-eds debated whether wealthy families were held to different standards in the legal system. Through it all, I tried to stay focused on the truth and justice, not the circus surrounding it. My confidence grew despite the intimidation tactics. Brandon had tried to silence me with a knife. Richard had tried to silence me with money and threats. But I found my voice was stronger than all of their efforts combined. The courtroom was packed on the opening day of the trial. Journalists filled the press section. Sketch artists captured the scene since cameras weren't allowed, and the gallery was a mix of curious public, supporters from victim advocacy groups, and Richard's business associates showing solidarity. Brandon sat at the defense table looking somber in a navy suit, his hair neatly trimmed, the picture of an upstanding young man unjustly accused. Richard and my mother sat directly behind him in the first row. My mother wouldn't meet my eyes, but Richard stared at me with cold calculation. I sat beside Prosecutor Jensen, focusing on my breathing the way my therapist had taught me. Rachel and her parents were right behind me, their presence a physical reminder that I wasn't alone. Stratton's opening statement painted me as a troubled, jealous young woman who resented her stepbrother's wealth and status and had manufactured accusations to tear the family apart. "The evidence will show that Miss Mitchell has been fabricating stories about Brandon Wilson since the day their parents married," Stratton told the jury confidently. This stabbing incident is merely the most extreme in a pattern of attempts to discredit a young man whose only crime was being born into privilege she envies. Jensen's opening was methodical and powerful. "This case isn't about wealth or privilege," she began. "It's about a young woman who was attacked in her bed in the middle of the night by someone who should have been family. Someone who had been stalking and terrorizing her for years while the adults who should have protected her looked the other way. The evidence will show not only that Brandon Wilson stabbed Alana Mitchell, but that his father systematically covered up his son's disturbing behavior for years, creating the conditions that led to this violent attack." The medical evidence was presented first. Dr. Patel testified about my wound, explaining in clinical detail why it could not have been self-inflicted. "The angle and depth of the wound is consistent with someone standing over the victim while she was lying down," she explained. "The defensive wounds on her hands suggest she was asleep when the attack began and tried to protect herself after the fact." Dr. Geller, Richard's private physician, was a reluctant witness. He admitted under questioning that Richard had pressured him not to report the assault as required by law. "I've treated the Wilson family for 15 years, he said, looking miserable. Richard made it clear this was a family matter to be handled privately. The digital forensics expert presented the evidence recovered from Brandon's devices. The jury visibly recoiled at the hundreds of photos taken of me without my knowledge, the disturbing searches about getting rid of stepsisters, and the spyware he'd installed on my devices. Stratton tried to argue that the evidence had been planted or that I had accessed Brandon's devices to frame him. The expert systematically dismantled these claims with technical evidence about timestamps and user patterns. My testimony came on the third day. Walking to the witness stand felt like the longest journey of my life. I could feel Brandon's eyes on me, cold and calculating. For 3 hours, I recounted the years of escalating behavior, the gaslighting, my parents' dismissal of my concerns, and finally, the night of the stabbing itself. I didn't cry, though I had expected to. Instead, I felt a calm certainty as I spoke the truth that had been denied for so long. Stratton's cross-examination was brutal. He tried to paint me as unstable, vindictive, and prone to exaggeration. He brought up therapy sessions I'd had after the divorce, suggesting they proved I had adjustment issues. He implied I was jealous of Brandon's relationship with his father, and that I'd invented the stalking allegations to get attention. "Isn't it true that you resented moving into the Wilson home because it meant you weren't the center of attention anymore?" he asked. "No," I replied steadily. "I resented moving into the Wilson home because shortly after we did, Brandon began invading my privacy and making me feel unsafe in my own space." Brandon testified next, maintaining his innocent facade with practiced precision. He claimed I had been hostile from the beginning, jealous of his relationship with his father and my mother. "I tried so hard to be a good brother to her," he said, his voice catching with obviously rehearsed emotion. "But nothing was ever good enough. She always looked at me like I was wrong somehow." "And the night of the incident?" Stratton prompted gently. "I heard a noise from her room. I was worried because she'd been acting strange all week. When I opened the door to check on her, she lunged at me with a knife. I only grabbed it to defend myself. I never meant to hurt her. It was a compelling performance." I saw a juror dab at her eyes, but Jensen was prepared. During cross-examination, she methodically deconstructed his story, highlighting inconsistencies in his timeline, the physical evidence that contradicted his claims, and his documented history of lying. "If you were merely checking on Alana out of concern," Jensen asked, "why does the neighbor's security footage show you retrieving something from the garden shed at 1:30 a.m., 20 minutes before the attack?" Brandon's composure slipped for the first time. That's not what happened. The footage clearly shows you, Brandon. Just as your phone's location data shows you moving throughout the house before the attack, not sleeping in your room as you claimed." As Brandon's testimony unraveled, his arrogant demeanor began to crack. His answers became clipped, his expression hardening when Jensen pressed him on contradictions. My mother's testimony was painful to watch. She sat on the stand, twisting her wedding ring, caught between maternal instinct and her loyalty to Richard. She claimed she couldn't remember details from the night of the stabbing, that she had been too overwhelmed to process what she saw. When Jensen showed her photos of my wound, she looked away, tears streaming down her face. "Mrs. Wilson," Did you ever witness Brandon entering Alana's room without permission? Jensen asked. I don't recall, my mother whispered. Did you dismiss Alana's concerns about her safety in the home? We thought she was having trouble adjusting, my mother said defensively. Blending families is hard. So hard that stabbings are to be expected? Jensen asked sharply. Richard's testimony was a masterclass in controlled arrogance. He portrayed himself as a loving father, trying to blend two families while dealing with a troubled, attention-seeking stepdaughter. He denied any knowledge of Brandon's disturbing behavior and claimed he had only been protecting his family by handling the stabbing privately. In retrospect, perhaps we should have gone directly to the hospital, he conceded, the only point on which he admitted any error. The trial took an unexpected turn when Maria Gonzalez, the former housekeeper, took the stand. She testified about finding Brandon in my room multiple times when I wasn't home, seeing him take items of my clothing, and witnessing Richard tell Brandon to be more discreet rather than stopping the behavior. Most damning of all, Maria revealed that after being fired, she had taken something from the house, Brandon's journal, which she had found while cleaning his room. I knew something was wrong in that house, she said firmly. I took it because I was afraid for the girl. Stratton objected vehemently, arguing the journal had been obtained illegally and should be inadmissible. After lengthy arguments in chambers, Judge Connolly ruled that while Maria's taking of the journal was improper, its contents were admissible given the serious nature of the charges and its relevance to establishing intent. The journal contained explicit entries detailing Brandon's obsession with me, his resentment of my place in the family, and most disturbing of all, his plans to remove me from the family one way or another. Dad says I need to handle the Alana situation, one entry read. He doesn't understand that there's only one way to truly handle it. She doesn't belong in our bloodline. She's an intruder, and intruders need to be eliminated. Another entry, dated just a week before the stabbing, read, Dad's lost patience. Says if I don't deal with her, he will. But he means sending her away to some school. That's not permanent enough. I need a solution that ensures she never comes back. As the journal entries were read aloud, several jurors looked physically ill. Brandon's calm facade finally shattered completely. She deserved it, he shouted suddenly, jumping to his feet. She was trying to take my father away from me. She tried to ruin everything. The courtroom erupted in chaos. Judge Connolly ordered the jury out while bailiffs restrained Brandon. Richard tried to approach the bench but was ordered back to his seat. My mother sobbed openly. When order was restored, financial records were presented showing payments Richard had made to the families of other potential victims of Brandon's behavior, including his ex-girlfriend Sophia and a former babysitter who had complained about inappropriate behavior when Brandon was younger. These payments, totaling over $500,000, were disguised as consulting fees or property investments, the forensic accountant testified. But there is no evidence any consulting or investment activities ever took place. In his desperate attempt to exclude this new evidence, Stratton made a fatal mistake, claiming there was no proof Richard Wilson knew the extent of his son's disturbing behavior. Jensen immediately played a recording Detective Winters had obtained from Richard's former personal assistant, a conversation where Richard explicitly acknowledged Brandon's fixation on me and discussed ways to manage the situation without it becoming public. Brandon's outburst and the damning new evidence shifted the entire atmosphere of the trial. Even Stratton seemed deflated during closing arguments, falling back on procedural technicalities, rather than his earlier confident assertions of Brandon's innocence. Jensen's closing argument was powerful in its simplicity. This case is about a young woman who was failed by everyone who should have protected her, she told the jury. Failed by her mother, who chose her new husband over her daughter's safety. Failed by her stepfather, who enabled and covered up his son's escalating behavior. And finally, attacked by her stepbrother, who believed his family's wealth and influence placed him above the law. Today, you have the power to show that no one is above justice, no matter how privileged or powerful. As the jury filed out to begin deliberations, I caught Brandon's eye for the first time since the trial began. The mask was completely gone now. What I saw was pure hatred, and in that moment, I knew with absolute certainty that he would have eventually killed me if I had stayed in that house. For 3 excruciating days, the jury deliberated. I stayed with Rachel's family, jumping every time my phone rang, unable to sleep for more than an hour or two at a stretch. The waiting was almost worse than the trial itself. Richard continued his attempts to influence the outcome. 2 jurors reported being approached by associates of his, though they couldn't prove direct connection. Judge Connolly sequestered the jury as a precaution. The threats against me escalated. My car's tires were slashed in Rachel's driveway. Anonymous messages became more explicit. Even if he goes to jail, you'll never be safe. Detective Winters arranged for patrol cars to drive by the Curtis home regularly. Media coverage intensified as deliberations dragged on. Reporters camped outside the courthouse. My case had struck a nerve, becoming a symbol of privilege, family violence, and the question of whether justice was truly blind to wealth and influence. I received unexpected support from domestic violence organizations, other survivors, and even strangers who recognized the patterns of abuse and gaslighting in my story. Justice for Alana trended on social media. Then, on a rainy Thursday afternoon, the call came. The jury had reached a verdict. Returning to the courtroom felt surreal. The gallery was packed even tighter than before. Richard sat stone-faced in the front row, my mother pale beside him. Brandon looked confident again, having regained his composure after his outburst. He even winked at me as I took my seat beside Prosecutor Jensen. The tension was palpable as the jury filed in. No one seemed to breathe as the judge addressed the foreman. Has the jury reached a verdict? We have, Your Honor. Judge Connolly instructed Brandon to rise. He stood smoothly, straightening his tie, the picture of a respectable young man, on the charge of attempted murder in the first degree. How do you find? The foreman's voice rang out clearly. Guilty. The courtroom erupted. Brandon's face contorted in disbelief and rage. Richard stood up, shouting about appeals and judicial bias. My mother collapsed in her seat, wailing. I sat perfectly still, tears streaming silently down my face as relief washed over me like a physical wave. Judge Connolly banged his gavel repeatedly, calling for order. Brandon lunged toward me, having to be physically restrained by bailiffs, screaming obscenities and threats. I'll kill you when I get out. You're dead. You hear me? Dead. His mask had completely shattered, revealing the monster I had always known was there. Several jurors looked shocked at his transformation from the composed young man who had testified to this raging, violent figure being dragged from the courtroom. When order was finally restored, Judge Connolly addressed the court before pronouncing the sentence. In my 30 years on the bench, I have rarely seen a case that so clearly demonstrates how wealth and privilege can corrupt not just individuals but entire family systems, he said gravely. Mr. Wilson, you were enabled and protected by your father, who used his influence to cover up what appears to be a pattern of disturbing behavior. Rather than getting you the help you clearly needed, he taught you that money could make problems disappear. Today, you learn that some things cannot be bought. Brandon stood rigidly between 2 bailiffs as the judge continued. The premeditated nature of this attack, your lack of remorse, and the psychological torture you inflicted on your victim for years leading up to the assault demand significant consequences. It is the judgment of this court that you be sentenced to 15 years in state prison, with possibility of parole after serving 10 years. Brandon was led away in handcuffs, still shouting threats and obscenities over his shoulder. As he disappeared through the door to the holding cells, the reality hit me. It was over. He couldn't hurt me anymore. Richard immediately called an impromptu press conference on the courthouse steps, denouncing the trial as a witch hunt and the verdict as judicial activism. We will appeal this gross miscarriage of justice, he declared to the assembled reporters. My son is the victim of class prejudice and a prosecutor with political ambitions. This is not the end. I avoided the media circus, slipping out through a side entrance with Detective Winters. As we reached the parking lot, I heard someone calling my name. It was my mother, running toward me in the rain, mascara streaming down her face. Alana, please, she sobbed, reaching for me. Can we talk? Please? I looked at this broken woman who had chosen her husband and stepson over her daughter's safety, who had sat in court and tried to defend the indefensible. Not today, I said quietly. Maybe someday, but not today. Detective Winters drove me back to Rachel's house, where I sat in stunned silence trying to process everything that had happened. "It doesn't feel real yet," I told Rachel that night. "I keep expecting to wake up back in that house, with him standing over my bed." "He can't hurt you anymore," she reminded me, squeezing my hand. "You're safe now." That first night after the verdict, I slept through the night for the first time in 2 years. The nightmare wasn't completely over. There would be appeals, civil suits, and the long process of healing, but for the first time, I could see a future beyond survival. The next morning, Detective Winters called with news that made that future look even brighter. "We're opening an investigation into Richard Wilson," she told me. "The evidence from the trial gave us enough to get warrants for his business records. This goes deeper than just covering for Brandon. There's fraud, witness, tampering, bribing officials. He's going down too." Justice, it seemed, was just beginning. 2 years after the verdict that changed everything, I stood at a podium addressing a room full of law enforcement officers, victim advocates, and social workers. My presentation, recognizing patterns of family violence, had become part of the standard training for police departments across 3 states. "The wounds that leave no visible scars are often the most damaging," I told them. "Gaslighting, manipulation, and psychological abuse create a foundation where physical violence becomes possible, even inevitable." In the back of the room sat Detective Winters, now Lieutenant Winters, nodding in approval. After my case, she had been promoted to head a new special victims unit focusing on family violence. We had become unlikely friends and powerful allies in changing how the system approached cases like mine. So much had happened in those 2 years. I had completed my associate's degree and transferred to a university in Washington State, where I was now in my final year of a double major in psychology and criminal justice. My thesis on the intersection of wealth, power, and family violence had already been accepted for publication in a respected journal. Brandon's appeal had been denied. His prison adjustment had been predictably rocky. Without his father's protection, he struggled with the reality of consequences. He'd been moved to a medium security facility after multiple disciplinary incidents. The psychiatric evaluation ordered during his classification had finally resulted in diagnoses that explained but did not excuse his behavior: antisocial personality disorder and narcissistic personality disorder. Richard's fall from grace had been spectacular and complete. The investigation sparked by evidence from Brandon's trial had uncovered decades of fraud, tax evasion, witness tampering, and evidence of bribing local officials. His car dealership empire crumbled as investors fled and banks called in loans. He was currently awaiting trial on 27 felony counts. Most of his assets had been frozen, including the mansion. My mother had moved into a modest apartment, funded by selling the few pieces of jewelry that were legally hers. She had finally filed for divorce after Richard drained their joint accounts before they were frozen. My relationship with her was cautiously rebuilding. After months of therapy, both individual and together, we had established a fragile connection. She had sobered up, joined a support group, and was working part-time at a florist shop. She sent cards on birthdays and holidays, always signed with "I'm so sorry" alongside "I love you." I wasn't ready to forgive her completely, but I recognized she had been a victim of Richard's manipulation too, albeit in different ways than I had been. She had chosen poorly, repeatedly, but she was trying to make amends. That counted for something. The Curtis family, Rachel and her parents, remained my rock. They had given me not just a safe place to stay, but a model of what healthy family dynamics looked like. Mr. Curtis had become something of a father figure, teaching me to change my own oil and checking in on my safety measures at my new apartment. Mrs. Curtis called weekly just to chat, never pushing but always present. Maria Gonzalez, the housekeeper whose testimony had been so crucial, had opened her own cleaning business with my help setting up a website. She now employed 5 other women, all survivors of domestic violence. The journal she had taken from Brandon's room was still being studied by researchers developing risk assessment tools for family violence cases. Judge Connolly had retired shortly after my case, citing health concerns, though many suspected the political pressure from Richard's connections had played a role. Before leaving the bench, he had reached out to me, offering mentorship and connections in the legal community. His letter of recommendation would be part of my law school applications the following year. 6 months after the verdict, I had received a letter from Brandon. Unlike the remorseful letters featured in movies, his was filled with blame, self-pity, and thinly veiled threats for when he eventually got out. I had turned it over to Lieutenant Winters without reading beyond the first paragraph. It went into his file and would be considered at his eventual parole hearing. In contrast, my own journey had been one of growth and reclamation. I still had nightmares occasionally, still startled at unexpected noises, still slept with a baseball bat beside my bed, but I had also found strength I never knew I possessed, purpose in helping others recognize and escape similar situations, and joy in building a life entirely my own. I had moved into my own apartment, adopted a rescue dog named Justice. Yes, the name was intentional, and even started dating again cautiously, with clear boundaries and open communication. My current boyfriend, Miguel, was studying social work and understood the impact of trauma better than most. I had started speaking at conferences and training sessions after an article about my case went viral. My story resonated with people because it highlighted how family violence could happen in any demographic, how wealth and privilege could enable abuse, and how systems designed to protect victims often failed when faced with power and influence. The housekeeper's story had become a key part of my presentations, teaching law enforcement to look beyond the obvious witnesses to household staff, delivery people, and others who might observe family dynamics without being part of them. Richard made one final desperate attempt to contact me 6 months ago. Despite the restraining order, he had somehow gotten a message to me through a mutual acquaintance, suggesting he could make things easier for everyone if I spoke on his behalf at his upcoming trial. The message included a veiled threat. Remember, Brandon won't be in prison forever. I had forwarded the message to Lieutenant Winters, and Richard had been charged with violating the restraining order, adding yet another count to his growing list of charges. My mother had finally chosen me over Richard, testifying truthfully about financial documents she had signed under his direction. Her testimony would likely add years to his sentence. It was too little, too late in many ways, but it was something. On the 2-year anniversary of the verdict, I gathered with my chosen family, Rachel and her parents, Lieutenant Winters, my trauma support group, and a few close friends from university. As we shared a meal, my phone buzzed with a news alert. Richard Wilson had been indicted on additional charges of witness tampering related to my case. The circle was closing. Justice, slow but relentless, was being served. To Alana, Rachel's father toasted, raising his glass, who taught us all that blood doesn't make a family. Love, respect, and truth do. I looked around at these people who had believed me, supported me, and helped me rebuild my life from the ashes of betrayal. This was what family should be. Later that night, as Miguel and Justice, the dog, dozed on the couch, I stood on my small balcony, looking at the stars. I thought about that terrified young woman waking up to a knife in the dark and wished I could tell her, "You will survive this. You will thrive. You will transform your pain into purpose and help others do the same." I've shared my story today because I know there are so many of you out there facing your own family betrayals. If my experience has taught you anything, I hope it's that you deserve safety, truth, and justice, no matter how powerful those who hurt you might seem. Have any of you had to rebuild your life after family betrayal? What helped you find your strength? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. Please like and subscribe if this resonated with you, and share with anyone who might need to hear that they're not alone and that healing is possible. Thank you for listening to my journey from victim to survivor to advocate. Remember, your worth isn't determined by those who failed to see it.